The walk from the ballroom to the museum's private wing felt like a mile of broken glass. Each step was a fresh agony, taken under the weight of 100 scrutinizing stares. The whispers followed her, a sibilant, serpentine tide of gossip and judgment. She kept her head held high, a lifetime of training kicking in, her posture a defiant armor against their prying eyes. But inside, her heart was a wild bird beating against the bars of her ribs, desperate for escape. With every footstep, on the cold marble floor, a strange and unfamiliar resolve began to crystallize within her. The humiliation was a fire, and it was burning away the dutiful daughter, leaving something harder and more resilient in its place. She was no longer just walking toward her father, she was walking toward a reckoning. The room her father used as a temporary office was as cold and silent as a mausoleum. The transition from the cacophony of the gala was jarring, the sudden quiet pressing in on her, amplifying the frantic thrumming of her own pulse. Avery Campbell stood by a window overlooking the snow-dusted park, his silhouette a rigid monument to power and control. He didn't turn as she entered, didn't offer a single word of comfort or greeting. He simply waited, letting the oppressive silence do his work for him. The air was sterile, devoid of any familial warmth, smelling only of old books and his expensive, unforgiving cologne. This was not a father's study. It was a corporate execution chamber. Finally, he turned, his face carved from granite, his eyes the color of a winter storm. "This is a catastrophe," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm instrument of command. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask for her side of the story. He spoke only of the consequences, the damage to the Campbell brand, the stock, price, the carefully curated public image. "You have been careless, Avery. You have allowed a parasite to attach himself to this family, and you have made us a laughingstock." He spoke of her love as if it were a bad investment, a foolish acquisition that now had to be liquidated at a loss. A small, desperate ember of hope inside her, the childish wish that he might see her pain, was instantly extinguished by the icy blast of his words. In that moment, she saw him not as her father, but as the world saw him, a ruthless CEO managing a crisis. And with that clarity came a searing, painful memory. Her mother, a brilliant artist with a soul full of color, slowly fading to gray within the walls of this same man's world. She remembered her mother's empty eyes in the final years, the canvases left blank in her studio. Her father hadn't just broken her mother's heart. He had dismantled her spirit, piece by methodical piece. He moved to his desk, a vast expanse of polished mahogany that served as a barrier between them. From a sleek leather portfolio, he produced a single sheet of paper and slid it across the glossy surface. "Fortunately," he continued, his tone suggesting this was a minor inconvenience he had already solved, "this is manageable. You will sign this prepared statement. It will be released to the press within the hour." He leaned back in his chair, the picture of absolute authority. "Then you will end this embarrassment, sever all contact, and you will never see that man again. Do that and you will remain a part of this family and this company." The ultimatum was delivered without emotion, a simple statement of fact. Her eyes fell upon the paper. It was a press release, drafted by a team of lawyers and public relations experts. The text was cold and clinical, disavowing Liam in the strongest possible terms. It painted him as a manipulative opportunist who had preyed on her supposed naivety. It depicted her as the victim, a poor little rich girl who had been momentarily led astray but had now come to her senses, safely back under her father's protection. It was a perfectly crafted lie, a public relations masterpiece designed to save the brand. It was also a complete and utter betrayal of the only real thing in her life, a document that would assassinate the character of the man she loved. As her eyes scanned the cruel corporate words, another image flashed in her mind. Liam, on his knees in the dirt of a community garden they had volunteered at, teaching a child how to plant a seed. The gentle patience in his eyes, the genuine kindness that radiated from him. He was the furthest thing from the monster this paper described. He was the only person who had ever looked past the Campbell heiress and seen just Avery. He had nurtured her own buried dreams of being an art curator, dreams she had abandoned to please the very man who now demanded she sacrifice her heart for his empire. This piece of paper wasn't just a lie. It was a sacrilege, a lifetime of suppressed anger, of swallowed truths and silent resentments began to surge within her. It was a righteous, terrifying wave of emotion that she had never allowed herself to feel before. It was the anger of her mother's ghost. It was the anger of her own caged soul. She lifted her gaze from the document, her vision startlingly clear. She looked at her father, at the man who had taught her the price of everything but the value of nothing. She saw the unwavering certainty in his eyes, the absolute conviction that he owned her, that her life was just another asset on his balance sheet. But he was wrong. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt as though it was powered by the turning of the earth itself, she placed her hands on the press release. The paper was cool and smooth beneath her fingertips, a flimsy thing to hold, the weight of her entire future. She pushed it back across the desk. The small, sliding sound was the only noise in the cavernous, silent room, yet it echoed with the force of a tectonic shift. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was hers. It was the first brick she had ever thrown at the walls of her prison. Her father's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief disturbing his iron control. The word formed in her throat, a foreign and powerful thing. It rose from a place of deep, newfound strength, fueled by love and the memory of a spirit he had already crushed once before. She would not let it happen again. Not to her. She met his icy stare with a fire of her own, the deep blue of her eyes turning to cobalt steel. The air in the room grew taut, stretched to its breaking point, waiting for the single word that would ignite the future. And then, with a quiet, steely resolve that shocked them both, she spoke it into existence. No. The cavernous ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a universe sculpted from ice and ambition. Outside the grand arched windows, snowflakes descended upon New York City, a silent, sterile blanket covering the world in white. But inside, the air was anything but pure, thick with the cloying scents of 1,000 expensive perfumes mingling together. It was the scent of power, a fragrance of strategic alliances and whispered negotiations. Avery Campbell stood at its epicenter, a statue carved from silver and societal expectation. Her gown shimmered under the crystalline light of the chandeliers, a perfect armor for the perfect heiress. Her smile was a masterpiece of careful construction, but her eyes held the truth of a soul in a gilded cage. She felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle deep within her bones, a cold counterpoint to the room's manufactured warmth. Each polite nod, each empty compliment, was a small chip against her spirit. She had been trained for this life since birth, taught to navigate these shark-infested waters with a grace that betrayed no weakness. But tonight, the performance felt heavier than usual. The mask of the dutiful daughter fused to her skin. Her thoughts, untamed and rebellious, kept drifting away from the drone of conversation, escaping the city to a small Brooklyn apartment, where love didn't have a price tag, and a man with calloused hands held her as if she were the only treasure that mattered. The change in the room was subtle at first, a barely perceptible shift in its harmonic hum. It was like a single string on a violin snapping in the middle of a symphony. The polite murmurings did not cease, but their pitch changed, tightening with a new, thrilling energy. Avery noticed heads turning, not towards the ice sculptures or the champagne fountains, but down towards the glowing screens of their phones. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, spreading like a virus from one jewel-laden guest to another. Eyes once filled with calculated admiration now darted towards her, gleaming with a fresh, cruel curiosity. The air, already thin, grew, suddenly hard to breathe. A prickle of unease traced a cold path down her spine, an instinct honed by a lifetime of public scrutiny. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. She saw it in the way a rival's wife, Margaret, looked at her from across the room, her lips curled into a smirk of pure schadenfreude. Avery's gloved hand tightened around the stem of her champagne flute, the delicate glass threatening to shatter under the pressure. She scanned the faces of her supposed friends, seeing pity in some, morbid fascination in most. They were vultures circling, sensing a kill. Her perfect world, so meticulously maintained, was beginning to fracture at the edges, and she was the only one who didn't seem to know why. Then, a figure detached from the crowd, gliding towards her with the predatory grace of a panther. It was Beatrice Vance, a society columnist whose pen was as sharp as a stiletto. Beatrice held her phone like a weapon, the screen angled just so, her expression a mask of feigned sympathy. "Avery, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with poison honey. "I am so sorry. You simply must see this. It's on every news feed." Avery's gaze dropped to the illuminated screen, her heart beginning to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She saw a photograph of herself, and beside her, the warm, honest face of Liam Roberts. But the headline above it was what stole the air from her lungs. "Billionaire heiress's dirty little secret." The words were crude, violent, designed to inflict maximum damage. "Toy boy gardener digs for gold." Each syllable was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile peace she had secretly nurtured for 6 beautiful months. The room began to tilt, the polite chatter dissolving into a roaring static in her ears. A dizzying wave of nausea washed over her as the world she knew, the world of galas and boardrooms, collided with the world she cherished, the world of quiet evenings and genuine laughter. The collision was a brutal public execution of her heart, broadcast for the entertainment of the very people she despised. The photograph was the cruelest cut of all. It was from their first real date, a simple walk through a Brooklyn park. She remembered the exact moment it was taken, the feeling of Liam's hand in hers, the way he had made her laugh, a real, uninhibited laugh that had felt like a rebellion. The paparazzi had captured that moment of pure, unguarded joy and twisted it into something sordid and ugly. They had taken Liam's kind, disarming smile and painted it as the smirk of a predator. They had taken her happiness and labeled it a transaction. The article was a lie, a carefully crafted assassination of his character and her choice. She felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare, dissecting her shame. The silver gown that had felt like armor moments before now felt like a cage of ice, its weight pressing down, constricting her chest. She couldn't breathe. She was no longer Avery Campbell, vice president of acquisitions. She was a headline, a scandal, a fool who had dared to love outside her gilded prison and was now being punished for it. Her meticulously crafted facade, the product of 26 years of relentless training, crumbled into dust, leaving her exposed and utterly, terrifyingly vulnerable in the center of the unforgiving spotlight. Her desperate gaze swept the room, searching for an anchor in the swirling vortex of judgment. And then she saw him. Her father, Harrison Campbell, stood near the grand staircase, his posture rigid, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He wasn't looking at her with concern or even anger. He was looking at her as a CEO would look at a catastrophic PR failure, a liability that needed to be managed, contained, and neutralized. In his eyes, she saw no hint of a father's love, only the icy calculation of a king whose dynasty had just been threatened by the foolish heart of his princess. He didn't move towards her. He didn't have to. With a sharp, almost imperceptible flick of his chin, he gave the command. "My office, now." The unspoken threat was louder than the orchestra, more chilling than the winter air outside. Her secret was out. Her love had been put on trial and found guilty without a defense. And now she had to face the judge, the jury, and the executioner all at once. Avery Campbell, the girl who had everything, stood on the precipice of losing it all, and the choice that was coming would not just define her future, but unearth the woman she was truly meant to be. The single word vibrated in the oppressive silence, an act of rebellion so profound it seemed to suck the very air from the room. For a fleeting moment, Harrison Campbell's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. It was a look Avery had never seen before. The expression of a king discovering his crown was made of tin. But the shock was swiftly consumed by a rage so cold it was like a physical force, a wave of glacial fury that washed over her. His eyes, once stormy, now became chips of ice. "Then you are nothing," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are no longer a Campbell. You are no longer my daughter. Walk out that door, and everything you are, everything you have, ceases to exist." Avery expected to feel terror, a shattering of her newfound resolve. Instead, a strange and liberating calm settled over her. The worst had happened. The threat that had loomed over her entire existence had been made real, and she was still standing. The gilded cage, which she had always feared leaving, had been opened from the outside, and she was being cast out. She looked at the man who was once her father, seeing only a stranger obsessed with power, and felt not hatred, but a deep, hollow pity. Without another word, she turned her back on him, on the sterile office, on the multi-billion-dollar empire, and walked toward the door with a steady, unwavering stride. Her first true act of freedom. Her journey back through the gala was a blur of hostile faces and stunned silence. News of the confrontation must have already spread, as the whispers that had followed her before now died completely as she passed. The crowd parted for her as if she were a ghost, their expressions a mixture of awe and morbid pity. She didn't meet their gazes. Their opinions, which had once governed her every move, were now meaningless static. Her silver gown, once a symbol of her status, now felt like a costume from a life she no longer lived. Her only focus was the grand entrance, the promise of the cold night air, the escape from this suffocating theater of wealth. Pushing through the heavy doors of the museum felt like breaking the surface of the water after being held under for too long. The biting December wind was a shock to her skin, a raw and honest sensation that made her feel, for the first time all night, truly alive. Snowflakes melted on her bare shoulders, the cold seeping into her bones, but it was a cleansing cold. A doorman rushed forward, umbrella in hand. "Miss Campbell, your car is waiting." Avery shook her head, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "I won't be needing it," she said, her voice clear and strong. She walked past him, away from the curb, and left the last remnant of her old identity behind on the snow-dusted steps. She hailed a yellow cab, the simple act feeling both clumsy and revolutionary. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, she watched the magnificent facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art recede in the rearview mirror, a monument to a life that was no longer hers. The city lights streaked past the window, a dazzling, blurry mosaic. And in the anonymous darkness of the back seat, the terror finally hit her. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. What had she done? She had no money, no home, no plan. She was adrift, stripped of the only identity she had ever known. The fear was a suffocating weight, whispering that her father was right, that she was nothing without him. The cab crossed the Brooklyn Bridge, leaving the glittering spires of Manhattan behind. It pulled up to a modest brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street, a world away from the Fifth Avenue palace she once called home. The building was old, with a certain worn-out charm, the lights in the windows casting a warm, inviting glow against the falling snow. For 6 months, this place had been her secret sanctuary, the one place she could breathe. Tonight, it was her only refuge. She paid the driver with the last $100 bill in her clutch, her hand trembling as she walked up the stone steps to the front door, the weight of her choice settling upon her. Liam opened the door on the first knock, his face a portrait of raw, aching concern. He had clearly seen the news. He was still in his work clothes, a smudge of charcoal on his cheek, his kind eyes filled with a fury that was entirely on her behalf. He didn't say a word about the tabloid, her father, or the fortune. He just looked at her, at the tear tracks, starting to form on her cheeks, at the shiver running through her frame. He reached out, his warm, calloused hands gently touching her arms. "Avery," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you okay?" The simple question, so full of genuine care, shattered the last of her composure. She fell into his arms, a sob tearing from her throat, a raw, ragged sound of a lifetime of grief and pressure being released all at once. The perfect silver gown was no match for the torrent of her sorrow. She wept for her lost mother, for her lost father, for the lost girl she had been for 26 years. Liam held her tightly, his strong arms a solid anchor in the storm that was her life. He didn't speak, just held her, stroking her hair as she cried, letting her pour out all the pain she had held inside for so long. His embrace was her only home now, his steady heartbeat the only truth in a world that had just been stripped bare. Later, wrapped in a warm blanket on his worn-out sofa, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, she told him everything. The words tumbled out of her, the coldness of her father's office, the cruel ultimatum, the soulless press release, and her single defiant word that had burned her entire world to the ground. She told him that she had chosen him, a life with him, over all of it. "I have nothing left, Liam," she whispered, her voice raw, searching his face for any flicker of regret, any hint that the burden of her choice was too much for him to bear. She had thrown away an empire for him, and the fear that it might be a mistake was a cold knot in her stomach. Liam listened to her story, his expression shifting from anger at her father to a deep, profound tenderness for her. When she finished, a slow, gentle smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and warmed her to her very soul. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "You haven't lost everything, Avery," he said, his voice firm with a conviction that chased the fear from her heart. "You just got rid of the things that were never really yours to begin with. You have yourself, for the first time. And you have me." He squeezed her hand. "We'll face them together." In that moment, she knew her father was wrong. She wasn't nothing. She was finally free. The first morning of her new life dawned with a quiet gray light filtering through the single window of Liam's bedroom. Avery woke up slowly, tangled in his arms, the scent of his skin a comforting reality in a world turned upside down. For a single blissful moment, she forgot everything. There were no galas, no boardrooms, no expectations. There was only the gentle rhythm of his breathing and the peaceful silence of a Brooklyn morning. She saw her silver gown from the night before, a shimmering, grotesque husk of her past life draped over a simple wooden chair. It looked absurd here, an artifact from a distant and foreign land. She smiled, feeling a sense of peace. That peace was shattered by the shrill ring of Liam's phone. He answered it, his voice still thick with sleep, but it quickly sharpened with disbelief. Avery watched as the color drained from his face, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. He didn't say much, just a series of clipped, "I understands," When he hung up, he looked at her, his expression a mixture of shock and grim resignation. "That was my boss," he said, the words heavy and stark in the quiet room. "Campbell Industries just pulled all their contracts with the firm. My employment has been terminated, effective immediately." The first shot in her father's war had been fired, and it had hit its mark perfectly. A wave of guilt so profound, it felt like a physical blow crashed over Avery. This was her fault. Her act of defiance, her grand choice for love and freedom, had just cost this good, brilliant man his livelihood. She had dragged him from the safety of his own life and placed him directly in her father's line of fire. "Liam, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is because of me. I've ruined you." He immediately came to her side, pulling her into an embrace, but she could feel the tension in his frame. "This is not your fault, Avery," he said, his voice a low, determined rumble. "This is your father's. We knew he would fight back." But the words did little to silence the screaming voice of doubt in her mind. Over the next week, the true, terrifying scope of her father's influence became clear. Liam, ever the optimist, polished his portfolio and began applying for new positions. He was a rising star in landscape architecture. He shouldn't have had any trouble. But every door was slammed shut in his face. Emails went unanswered. Interviews were abruptly canceled without explanation. One old colleague, speaking in hushed tones over a burner phone, confirmed their fears. The word had come down from on high. Liam Roberts was blacklisted. No reputable firm in the city would dare touch him, lest they incur the wrath of Harris and Campbell and his vast, vengeful empire. The financial strangulation was just as swift and merciless. Avery's attempt to buy groceries ended in a moment of burning humiliation, as every single one of her credit cards was declined. The cashier's look of pity was almost unbearable. Back at the apartment, her hands shaking, she called the private bank that had managed her finances since birth. A clipped, impersonal voice on the other end of the line informed her that, per her father's instructions, all her accounts had been frozen and were under review for closure. In the space of a single week, she had gone from an heiress with unlimited resources to a woman who couldn't afford a carton of milk. She was officially, terrifyingly penniless. Desperate, she tried to reach out to the people she had once called her friends. The calls went straight to voicemail. The carefully worded texts were met with a deafening silence. The few who replied offered flimsy, transparent excuses. They were busy, they were traveling, they would call her back. They never did. She was a pariah. Her father hadn't just cut her off financially, he had excommunicated her from their entire social class, branding her as a traitor to their gilded tribe. The loneliness was a physical ache, a chilling realization that every relationship in her former life had been built on the shifting sands of status and wealth, not genuine affection. The final, cruelest blow came in the form of a certified letter, slid under their apartment door. It was an eviction notice. Their landlord, a man who had always been kind and accommodating, was now claiming they had violated an obscure clause in their lease. The reason was laughably false, a clear fabrication, but it was legally binding. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. It was no longer just about controlling her or ruining Liam's career. Her father was actively trying to put them on the street. He was not just aiming to win, he was aiming to utterly and completely destroy them, to make her regret her choice in the most brutal way imaginable. One evening, they sat in the darkening apartment, a pile of unpaid bills and rejection, letters on the small kitchen table between them. The weight of their situation felt immense, a physical presence in the room, suffocating them. Avery looked at Liam's face, etched with exhaustion and strain, and the guilt she felt was a venomous serpent coiling in her gut. Was love really enough to survive this? Was her desperate grasp for freedom worth the price of his future? The thought that she had selfishly destroyed him for her own happiness was a burden that threatened to crush her spirit completely, whispering to her that she should have just signed the paper. Liam must have seen the despair swirling in her eyes. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, a small island of warmth in a sea of cold fear. "I know this is hard," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "I'm scared too, Avery. But I am not sorry. Not for a second." He got up and pulled a dusty art history book from a shelf, opening it to a page about small, independent galleries that had changed the world. "Your father took our jobs. He's taking our home. But he can't take this," he said, tapping the page. "He can't take our dreams unless we let him." His belief in her, even now, was a defiant light against the encroaching darkness. His words, spoken in the face of their impending ruin, did not magically solve their problems, but they did reignite a flicker of fight within her soul. He wasn't giving up. He wasn't blaming her. He was still looking toward a future they could build together. They had been stripped of everything: money, status, security, friends. All they had left was each other, and the terrifying, exhilarating freedom to build a life from scratch. It was a daunting, almost impossible task, but as she looked into his hopeful eyes, she knew it was the only fight that had ever truly mattered. They would not be broken. If this story touched you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story from. Your support is what motivates us to keep bringing you romances that warm the heart. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of anxiety and rejection. The city, once Avery's playground, now felt like a hostile labyrinth designed to thwart them at every turn. Liam spent hours in the local library using their computers to apply for any work he could find: construction, drafting, even manual labor, only to be met with a wall of silence. Avery, meanwhile, began the humiliating process of dismantling her past for cash. A pair of diamond earrings her mother had given her paid for 2 weeks' rent. A designer clutch she'd once worn to a premiere in Paris covered their groceries. Each transaction felt like a small death, stripping away the last vestiges of the person she used to be. Their small apartment, once a cozy sanctuary, began to feel like a pressure cooker. The 4 walls seemed to shrink with each passing day. The eviction notice on the fridge a constant, glaring reminder of their looming deadline. The strain began to wear on them, fraying the edges of their patience. A small argument erupted over a spilled coffee, their words sharp and laced with the unspoken terror that underpinned their every moment. It was a brief but ugly fissure, a glimpse into how easily their circumstances could poison the very love they were fighting for. The silence that followed was heavy with regret, and the chilling fear that their father's greatest weapon was not his money, but their own despair. One afternoon, while Liam was out on another fruitless job hunt, Avery sat on the floor, surrounded by the contents of a single box, the only personal effects she had managed to retrieve from her old life. It was filled with sentimental trinkets, yearbooks, and photographs. Her fingers brushed across a faded picture of her mother, taken years ago in her sun-drenched art studio. Her mother was smiling, a smudge of paint on her cheek, her eyes bright, with a creative fire that Avery had only seen in pictures. A wave of profound grief washed over her, a sorrow for the woman her mother was before the Campbell name had slowly and methodically extinguished that brilliant light. As she stared at the photograph, a hazy, long-forgotten memory surfaced from the depths of her childhood. She was 10 years old, and her mother was tucking her into bed. Her mother had pressed a small, ornately carved wooden box into her hands. "This is a secret, my love," her mother had whispered, her voice full of a strange urgency. "This is for your real life, Avery, the one you choose, not the one they plan for you. When you're ready to build something of your own, something beautiful, this will be your start." The memory was so vivid, so charged with meaning, It made the hair on her arms stand up. The box. It wasn't just a keepsake. A frantic energy seized her. Where was the box? She had never brought it to her last apartment, the sleek, minimalist penthouse her father had chosen for her. It was too personal, too full of a past he had wanted her to forget. She squeezed her eyes shut, digging through her memories. And then it came to her. Her mother, a woman who had learned to operate in the shadows of her husband's control, had not left it anywhere he could find it. Years ago, she had opened a safety deposit box for Avery at a small independent bank in a quiet neighborhood, a place far from her father's corporate sphere of influence, a place of her own. When Liam returned, weary and defeated, he found Avery vibrating with a desperate, hopeful energy. "I think my mother left me something," she explained, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A way out. A start." They scraped together the last of their cash, the money from the sold earrings, leaving just enough for a return trip. The subway ride to the bank was a study in unbearable tension. They held hands, their palms slick with sweat, not daring to speak. This was their last wild gamble. If the box was empty or held only sentimental trinkets, their hope would be extinguished for good. They were pinning the entirety of their future on a half-remembered whisper from a ghost. The bank was an old, quiet institution, a relic from another era. Avery, dressed in jeans and a borrowed sweater, felt like an imposter as she presented her key and identification. The vault was a cold, silent place, the air thick with the weight of forgotten secrets and hidden fortunes. The attendant, a prim, serious man, retrieved the box and placed it on the counter. It was exactly as she remembered, dark, polished wood, with a phoenix carved into the lid. It felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hands, as if it contained the entire weight of her past and the fragile possibility of her future. She and Liam were shown to a small private viewing room, with Liam's hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. Avery slowly lifted the lid, her breath caught in her throat. Inside, resting on a bed of faded black velvet, were not jewels or cash, but a sheaf of official-looking documents and a single sealed envelope addressed to her in her mother's elegant script. With shaking fingers, she lifted the papers. They were stock certificates, old ones, for a small, obscure tech company her mother had once mentioned, an investment her father had scoffed at as sentimental nonsense. Avery's heart hammered against her ribs as she saw the company's name, a name that had, in the last decade, become a household word. It was not a king's ransom. It was nothing compared to the vast Campbell fortune she had walked away from. But it was a seed. It was a lifeline. It was enough. Enough to find a new place to live. Enough to eat. Enough to breathe. More than that, it was enough to begin. Enough to fight back. It was a gift of foresight and quiet rebellion from a woman who had been denied her own escape. It was her mother's last, loving act of defiance, reaching across the years to save her daughter from the same fate that had consumed her. She had been left a weapon, forged from a mother's lost dreams. Her hands shaking, Avery opened the letter. She read her mother's words aloud, her voice thick with unshed tears. The letter spoke not of anger or bitterness, but of a deep, aching regret for having given up her own artistic passions. "Do not let them turn your vibrant colors to gray, my darling Avery," her mother had written. "He will teach you the price of everything, but you must never forget to find its value. Use this to build a life of your own making. A life filled with purpose and real, messy, beautiful love. It is the only legacy that matters." The letter was a blessing. It was permission. It was the final, unbreakable piece of armor for the battle that was to come. They were not victims anymore. They were builders. That night, in the small Brooklyn apartment that was soon to be their past, they didn't speak of survival. They spoke of creation. The stock portfolio lay on the table between them, not as a safety net, but as a foundation. Avery looked at the papers, then at Liam, a fierce, brilliant light in her eyes he had never seen before. "We can't just run," she said, her voice thrumming with a newfound purpose. "That money, it was my mother's dream deferred. I want to use it to build something she would have loved." And she told him her idea: a small, independent art gallery dedicated to talented, struggling artists, the very people her father's world ignored. Liam's face lit up, his exhaustion replaced by a surge of creative energy. He saw her vision instantly and made it his own. He grabbed a sketchbook and a piece of charcoal, his hands moving with a fluid grace. For hours they planned, their ideas weaving together, forming a tangible dream. He didn't design a cold, white box for displaying art. He designed a space that felt like a sanctuary. He sketched walls made of reclaimed wood, a skylight to bathe the room in natural light, and a small green courtyard in the back. It would be a place that nurtured art, not just commodified it. A place of warmth and integrity, the physical embodiment of their shared values. Their search for a location was a rejection of everything Avery had once known. They avoided the pristine, commercialized art districts of Chelsea and Soho, with their prohibitive rents and established hierarchies. Instead, they explored transitioning neighborhoods, places with grit and character. They found it on a forgotten corner in the Lower East Side, a derelict, boarded-up storefront, its windows clouded with decades of grime. It was a wreck, but it had high ceilings and a beautiful raw brick wall. It had a soul. It was a perfect metaphor for their mission, to find the beauty in things the rest of the world had discarded as worthless. They poured every cent of her mother's legacy into their dream, leasing the space and beginning the renovations themselves. The work was grueling, a world away from the lives they had known. They spent their days covered in dust and sweat, tearing down crumbling plaster, pulling up rotted floorboards, and scraping away layers of old paint. Liam, a master architect, was in his element, his calloused hands expertly framing new walls and restoring the building's hidden character. Avery worked alongside him, her muscles aching, her manicured nails broken and dirty. She was learning the simple, profound joy of building something real with her own two hands. Avery felt a profound transformation occurring within her, one that had nothing to do with her bank account or social standing. With each swing of a hammer, she was demolishing the ghost of the perfect heiress. With each new coat of paint, she was covering over the gray, colorless world her father had designed for her. She had paint in her hair, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a deep, satisfying exhaustion in her bones at the end of each day. She had never felt more powerful, more in control, or more authentically herself. She was no longer a statue in a ballroom. She was the artist of her own life. While Liam managed the physical construction, Avery embarked on the gallery's true mission. She spent her evenings and weekends scouring the city's underbelly for talent. She visited graduate art shows, explored tiny shared studios in warehouse districts, and followed obscure artists on social media. She wasn't looking for what was fashionable or marketable. She was looking for what was honest. She found a young sculptor working out of a garage in Queens, a brilliant painter who drove a taxi to make ends meet, and a photographer whose work was too raw and political for the mainstream. She wasn't just acquiring inventory, she was building a family of creators. One artist, a young woman named Maya, reminded Avery so much of the stories she'd heard about her mother. Maya's work was breathtaking, a vibrant explosion of color and emotion. But she was crippled by self-doubt and on the verge of giving up. Avery sat with her for hours in her cramped studio, speaking not as a curator, but as a kindred spirit. When Avery offered her the gallery's first featured show, the young artist began to cry, tears of disbelief and gratitude. In that moment, Avery knew this was her purpose. She was giving these artists the chance her mother never had, turning her inheritance of pain into a legacy of opportunity. Slowly, miraculously, their vision took shape. The dilapidated storefront transformed into a stunning, intimate space. The natural light from the new skylight illuminated the beautifully restored brick. It was a gallery that invited you in, that encouraged you to feel something, to connect. It was everything the cold corporate art world was not. One evening, standing in the nearly finished space, Liam wrapped his arms around her. "It needs a name," he said. Avery looked at the fresh white walls, a blank canvas for so many dreams, and thought of the fire they had walked through. "The Phoenix," she said, "for a rebirth from the ashes." Her father's shadow still loomed. They knew he was aware of their project. His silence was more menacing than any threat. Subtle obstacles appeared. A crucial building permit was mysteriously held up in a bureaucratic tangle for weeks. A lighting supplier they had a contract with suddenly and inexplicably pulled out at the last minute. But these attacks felt different now. Before, they had been blows against defenseless victims. Now, they were mere annoyances, obstacles to be overcome. Their shared purpose had forged a new kind of armor around them, one that his power and money could not so easily penetrate. On the eve of their grand opening, the gallery was quiet, filled with the scent of fresh paint and the palpable hum of nervous energy. The art was hung, the lights were perfectly angled, and the space was ready. Everything they had, every dollar, every ounce of strength, every desperate hope was invested in this single night. It was more than a business venture. It was a declaration of independence, a testament to their love, and a tribute to a lost artist's dream. They stood together in the center of the room, hand in hand, looking at what they had built. Their gamble was about to be tested, and they had no idea who was about to walk through the door. The Phoenix Gallery opened not with a formal, stuffy reception, but with a vibrant pulse of life. The crowd that streamed through the doors was not the polished, predatory society of her past. It was a beautiful, eclectic mix of people, art students, with paint-splattered jeans, elderly couples from the neighborhood, curious journalists from independent blogs, and the proud families of the featured artists. The air buzzed with genuine conversation and excited discovery. Music from a local jazz trio filled the space, and instead of champagne, people held cups of mulled wine, their laughter echoing warmly off the exposed brick walls. It was everything Avery had dreamed of, a space alive with community and passion. Avery moved through the room, her heart feeling fuller than it ever had before. She was not playing the role of the perfect hostess. She was in her element, her spirit unleashed. She spoke about Maya's bold use of color, about another artist's revolutionary sculpting technique, her words flowing from a place of deep knowledge and authentic love for the work. She saw Maya herself across the room, surrounded by a small group of admirers, her face once clouded with doubt, now glowing with a radiant, confident pride. In that moment, watching that young artist blossom in the light of recognition, Avery felt a sense of profound, soul-deep success that no corporate acquisition had ever given her. Liam stood near the back, by the small courtyard he had so lovingly designed, and simply watched her. The sight of Avery, so confident, so vibrant, so completely and utterly herself, was the only reward he had ever needed. This was the woman he had seen glimpses of all along, the one who had been trapped beneath layers of polish and expectation. He remembered the fragile, haunted look in her eyes at the Met Gala and compared it to the brilliant fire that burned there now. He had not saved her, he realized. He had simply stood by her while she saved herself. All the hardship, the fear, the struggle, it had all been worth it to witness this magnificent rebirth. Then, a sudden chill seemed to cut through the warmth of the room. The cheerful chatter near the entrance faltered, replaced by a tense hush that spread like a ripple through the crowd. A sleek black limousine, an alien vessel from another universe, had glided to a stop outside, its presence a stark and menacing intrusion. The chauffeur opened the rear door, and out stepped Harrison Campbell. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, his tailored suit a severe black armor against the colorful, chaotic energy of the neighborhood. He looked less like a guest and more like a conqueror surveying a newly acquired and disappointing territory. He entered the gallery, and the very atmosphere seemed to thin, the warmth receding in his wake. He was an emissary of a different world, a world of cold, hard numbers and strategic mergers, and he moved through this space of messy, emotional creation with an air of profound disdain. He did not look at the art on the walls. His sharp, calculating eyes swept over the scene, dismissing the passionate work as child's play, the diverse crowd as insignificant. His gaze cut through the room, finally landing on his daughter. He began to walk towards her, his stride as measured and relentless as the ticking of a clock. Avery saw Liam tense, ready to step in, to protect her. She gave him the slightest shake of her head, a silent message. I have to do this alone. This was the final test. Harrison led her to a quiet corner, the crowd instinctively parting to give them space. I must admit, Avery, he began, his voice a low, condescending purr. You have a certain tenacity. You've built this little project. You've made your point. He sounded like a father praising a child for a well-made mud pie, his words a thin veneer over his utter lack of respect for what she had accomplished. This was not a compliment. It was a prelude to a demand. But the game is over, he continued, his tone shifting, becoming the familiar voice of command she had defied once before. This was a valiant, if misguided, effort. It's time to end this foolishness and come home. He laid out his final offer, not with anger, but with the magnanimous air of a king offering a pardon. I will restore your position at the company. Your trust fund, your accounts will be reinstated. We can put this entire unfortunate embarrassment behind us. He was offering to put her back in the gilded cage, assuming that, having tasted the hardship of freedom, she would now gratefully accept the comfort of her prison. She looked at her father, at this powerful, commanding man, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear. The anger that had once fueled her was gone too, replaced by a wave of calm, clear-eyed compassion. She saw him not as a monster, but as a man trapped in a prison of his own making, a man who could only measure life in dollars and stock prices, and was blind to its real treasures. Thank you for the offer, Dad, she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. But I'm already home. She gestured to the lively room, to the vibrant art, to Liam watching her from across the gallery. I have never been richer than I am right now. His face tightened, his patience wearing thin, but before he could issue another command, she spoke the words that would sever the final chain. You taught me the price of everything, Dad, she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with a truth she had earned with her own two hands. You taught me how to acquire things, how to win, how to build an empire of assets. She paused, her gaze shifting to find Liam's, a universe of love passing between them. Liam, she said, her voice softening, taught me the value of it. And that is a lesson, a life, that I will never, ever sell. The words hung in the air between them, simple, honest, and absolute. They were a shield his power could not pierce, a truth his money could not buy. Harrison Campbell stood there, for the second time in his life, utterly speechless in the face of his daughter's will. He looked from her radiant, unyielding face to the joyful, thriving world she had built without him. A crack, for the first time, appeared in his armor of absolute certainty. He saw a world he couldn't control, a form of wealth he didn't possess. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the gallery, his retreat a quiet, stunning admission of defeat. The black car sped away, disappearing into the night, leaving only freedom in its wake. When the black limousine disappeared, it was as if a dark spell had been broken. A wave of warm, joyful energy surged back into the gallery, even stronger than before. The departure of Harris and Campbell had not gone unnoticed. An influential art critic, who had been quietly observing from the corner, approached Avery, her eyes wide with a newfound respect. "I came here tonight to see new art," the critic said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "But I think I've just witnessed the creation of a legend." The story of the Phoenix and its creators was already beginning to be written, a story of defiance, love, and the birth of something truly new. In the months that followed, the gallery became more than just a success. It became a phenomenon. The critic's glowing review, which focused as much on the gallery's heartfelt mission as it did on the breathtaking art, put the Phoenix on the cultural map. Collectors, curators, and art lovers flocked to the small space, drawn by its authenticity. Avery, no longer the disgraced heiress, was celebrated as a visionary curator with an unerring eye for talent. She had found her voice, not in a boardroom, but here, among the canvases and sculptures, building a business on her own terms, guided by passion instead of profit margins. Avery and Liam's love story, once a sordid headline in a tabloid, was now retold as an inspiring modern fairy tale. They were a testament to a love that had not only survived the fire, but had used it to forge something stronger and more beautiful. Their life was a partnership in every sense of the word. They made decisions together, celebrated triumphs together, and built a home filled with the same warmth and character as the gallery they had created. Their shared purpose was the unshakable foundation of their world, a world where their wealth was measured not in dollars, but in the life they had built together. Meanwhile, in a sterile penthouse overlooking Central Park, Harris and Campbell was learning the true meaning of bankruptcy. His empire was intact, his fortune secure, but he was utterly alone, adrift in an ocean of meaningless luxury. His daughter's parting words echoed in the silence of his life. He saw her thriving, celebrated and happy, all without a single dollar of his money. He saw the genuine love she shared with Liam, a treasure his vast wealth could not procure. For the first time, the man who had everything was forced to confront the crushing poverty of his own heart and the true cost of his relentless control. One rainy afternoon, a simple cream-colored envelope arrived at the gallery, bearing his familiar, sharp handwriting. Avery opened it with trepidation, but inside there were no legal threats, no corporate letterhead. There was only a small, simple card and 2 words written inside. "I'm sorry." That note was followed a week later by a tentative phone call. He didn't offer her money or her old life. He simply, humbly, asked if he could see her. He asked if he could properly meet the man who had helped his daughter find her true self. He was not asking as a CEO, but as a father who had finally realized what he'd lost. Their meeting in a quiet, neutral coffee shop was the beginning of a slow, careful reconciliation. Harrison was a different man, the arrogance stripped away, leaving a quiet, vulnerable core. He listened more than he spoke. He admitted his blindness, his fear, and his profound regret for how he had treated both her and her mother. He looked at Liam, not as a threat, but with a grudging, growing respect. It was not a magical fix, but it was a start. Over time, they began to build a new relationship, one based not on obligation or control, but on a fragile, hard-won, and genuine respect. 5 years later, the Phoenix was no longer just a gallery. It was a revered city institution. It had expanded into the building next door, and its charitable arm, the Avery Campbell Foundation, funded scholarships for a new generation of underprivileged artists, ensuring her mother's name was now a symbol of opportunity, not tragedy. The gallery was a beacon of hope in the art world, a testament to the idea that true art comes from the heart, a legacy of which Avery knew her mother would have been immensely proud. It was a thriving monument to a love that had built something, beautiful from the ashes of a broken past. Avery and Liam were now married, their bond the quiet, steady epicenter of their beautiful life. One evening, they stood in the warm light of their home, a space Liam had designed to be full of art and laughter, poring over architectural plans. They were designing a new, even larger arts center that would offer studio spaces and classes to the community. They were still building, still dreaming, their partnership a seamless blend of his structural genius and her artistic vision. They were not just running a business, they were nurturing a community, their love story expanding to include hundreds of others. Harrison Campbell was a frequent visitor to the gallery now. He was older, his hair grayer, the hard edges of his demeanor softened by time and humility. He could often be found talking quietly with the young artists, his questions full of genuine curiosity. One afternoon, Avery saw him smiling, a real, unguarded smile as he spoke with a young painter whose scholarship the foundation had sponsored. He caught his daughter's eye across the crowded room, and the look he gave her was one of pure, unadulterated fatherly pride, a look she had waited her entire life to see. In the end, Avery had found that true wealth was not something you could inherit, but something you had to build. It was crafted from love, forged in purpose, and polished by the courage to live an authentic life. She had walked away from an empire of price tags, and with the man she loved had built a kingdom of true value. Surrounded by art that stirred the soul and a love that had weathered every storm, she was, finally and completely, home, the richest woman in the world. If you like this video, please subscribe and leave a like. And if you watched until the very end, let us know by commenting with the keyword true value so we know you made it. Thank you for being part of our story.